Hi folks, welcome to this short lecture on warrants. To discuss warrants means we're beginning our study of stock options or stock rights. We've said in a previous class that an option or a right provides the holder, so whoever holds the option or the right, to buy shares at a later date at a fixed price. This fixed price is also known as a set price, which is an exercise price. A warrant is a type of option that's associated with a regular non-convertible. When I say regular bond, I mean a bond that's non-convertible. So the advantage to having a warrant, of course, is that in this case, because they trade separately from the bond, you don't have to convert the bond in order to get the shares. So we had taken earlier in the course the concept of a convertible bond, and that meant that we had to convert the bond either in whole or in part in order to get shares. In this case, you don't need to. The warrant is attached to a regular bond, which is non-convertible, and you can keep your regular bond and keep getting the interest, and then just instead detach or clip the warrant from the bond in order to get shares. So, as we said here, the warrant allows the investor to detach the warrant and use them to buy shares at a set price, which is the exercise price, without converting the bond. One of the key differences between a warrant and other options is that warrants are usually valid for a period of time which is longer than the options. So now, at the issue date, how do we record the warrant? Well, because the warrant is associated with the bond, at the issue date, what we need to do is we need to allocate the proceeds that we got for the bond with the warrant. We have to allocate them using the proportional method between the warrant itself and the bond. And when we say bond, we mean a regular bond without the warrant, or X warrants. At the exercise date, when the warrants are exercised, so in other words, when the holders of the warrants decide, if they decide, to exercise those warrants and get common shares for them, they have to pay cash to get the shares. All right? That's different from when you had convertible debt at maturity. Because remember, when we had convertible debt at maturity, what do? If the debt was convertible, whether it's at our option or even at the issuer's option, what would happen there is that we just debit the bond, remove any unamortized premium or discount if there was any, and then we'd use the book value method to issue the shares. And don't forget, we'd also get rid of the contributed capital on the stock options, right? So this is a little bit different, because here when you exercise the warrants, you actually have to pay cash at that time in order to get the shares, and the amount of cash you have to pay is going to be based on what the exercise price is. So now let's see how this theory actually translates into a problem. So let's take, for example, our Easy Corporation here, and they issue a $100,000 bond with an 8% coupon. It's a 10-year term, or it matures in 10 years. And notice the bond is non-convertible, because we did say when you have warrants, they're associated with non-convertible bonds. They're detachable warrants, meaning that we can clip them and exercise the warrants to get shares at a fixed price. Now, it says here that new company buys bonds from Easy Corporation. So Easy is the issuer, New is the investor, and they buy the bonds with the warrants for 105. Remember, that means it's 5% over and above the face value. So the face value of the bonds is 100,000. So they would be paying for this bond with the warrants 105,000 to get a $100,000 bond and the warrants. So that's 5% above the face value. Each warrant allows New to buy one share at $18 a share, so we now know our exercise price, right? So it's one warrant gets you one share, and each $1,000 bond has 10 warrants associated with it. So shortly after the issuance, or after they've been on the market trading, the warrants have a value that's established by the market of $6.50 each. That's one warrant. And the bonds are trading X warrants, or without the warrants, at 101.5. We need to know the value of the warrant without the bond, and we need to know the value of the bond without the warrant because we're using the proportional method. So we need to make sure that we have an idea of the market values of the warrant and the bond separate so that we can use those market values to allocate our package deal that we bought, the bond with the warrant, at 105, which is 5% over and above this face value, right? So we have to make the entry at the issue date when we issued this bond and paid 105 for it. We need to make the journal entry at the issue date. And again, we said we're going to use the proportional method to do this. So first off, what we need to do in order to value the warrants, or to split this cost of buying the bond that has the warrants attached, we need to make sure that we know the market value of the warrants and the market value of the bond. And we're going to use those market values in order to allocate the cost. This is what the proportional method says we need to do. So you'll remember we did study the proportional method in a previous chapter as well. So in order for us to get the market value of the warrants, we need to know how many warrants we have, right? We already know the value of each warrant is $6.50, but to get the value of the warrants as a package, we need to know how many warrants we have. Well, one thing we can use to help us calculate that is the fact that each $1,000 bond carries 10 warrants. So if we know how many $1,000 bonds we have, we can multiply it by 10 and come up with the number of warrants we have. We can take the number of warrants, multiply it by $6.50, which is the market value of each warrant, to get our total market value of the warrants only. So that's what we're doing. Each $1,000 bond carries 10 warrants, but we have 100 bonds valued at $1,000 each. How do I know that? Well, we have $100,000 in bonds, and we have our bonds in denominations of $1,000. So that means I have $100,000 bonds. So 100 bonds at 10 warrants, right? Because it says each $1,000 bond, it says here, each $1,000 bond carries 10 warrants. So I have $100,000 bonds and 10 warrants a bond. So that's 1,000 warrants. And those 1,000 warrants each have a market value of $6.50. So my total market value is $6,500. So I can take that market value there, add it to the market value of my bond. Remember, we were told up here that the bonds trade at 101.5, which is 1.5% over and above this face value without the warrants or X warrants. So that means that $101,500 plus my $6,500 market value gives me a total market value for the package of $108,000. But I only paid $105,000 to get the package. But I can use these relative or proportional market values to help me allocate this cost. So how would I do that? Well, I can take my $6,500 market value of the warrants and divide it by the total market value of the entire package, the warrants and the bonds. Multiply it by the cost in order to see that I have a cost on the warrants of $6,319. So to figure out the cost of the bonds, I can take the difference between the cost of the entire bundled package and the warrants and squeeze out the value of the bond, right? Or what I could do is I could just calculate the cost of the bond using the relative market value of $101,500 for just a regular bond divided by the market value of the total bundle and multiply that by $105,000. This is how we apply the proportional method. And that would give me $98,681. You can see here that we have a discount bond. Why? Because the bond is going to be carried at $98,681. But don't forget, the face value of the bond is $100,000. So when I'm recording the issue of the bond with the warrants at the issue date, I'm going to debit my cash for $105,000 because that's how much the investors are giving me, this $105,000 amount, right? Don't forget, I'm also issuing a bond payable at 100,000, but I know I have a discount on the bonds. How do I know? Because the face value is 100,000 and the carrying value is 98,681. That's what I got when I used the proportional method. So my discount is 1319, and I also have to record the contributed capital on the warrants, which is 6319. That's the value that I allocated of the entire cost of 105,000. That's the value I allocated using the proportional method. So that records our bond with the warrants at the issue date. Now, with this entry in mind, let's look at a Part B. What if the investor, who is New Corporation, remember New's the investor, they bought the bond from Easy Corporation. What if they decided to exercise the warrants when the market price of the common shares was $21 a share? I want you to make the entry to exercise the warrants. Well, now you have to remember two very important things here. Number one, we said earlier when we were talking about the warrants, giving you a little mini lecture here, we said here at the exercise date, when the warrants are exercised for shares, there is cash paid, right, to get the shares. So how many shares are they going to get? Well, we know in this example, it says each warrant allows you one share. Well, we already calculated down here that we've got 1,000 warrants. So if they exercise them all, they're getting 1,000 shares. But don't forget, they have to pay the exercise price of $18 a share. So down here, we're going to debit cash that we're getting at $18 a share for 1,000 shares. Don't forget, we have 1,000 warrants and they're all being exercised. One warrant gets you one share. So 1,000 shares at $18 a share is $18,000. We're using up all of our warrants. So we're going to debit the contributed capital on the warrants for what we set it up at $63.19. And using the book value method, as we said here, we're going to issue our common shares at $24,319. Now, what if instead of Part B, what we did, what if instead of B, let's say that the warrants were never exercised, right? So that must mean that the market price never got above the exercise price. Notice here in Part B what happened is because the market price of the shares were $21, although we didn't use the $21 in this entry, we needed, I just stated the value of $21 to prove to you that because the option or the shares were trading at $21 a share and you could buy them for $18, this would be a favorable situation where you would find that the investor would, if they chose to, exercise the warrants. So I just used the $21 to show you that in this situation, because the market exceeds the exercise price, this is a situation where the warrants could be exercised. And in fact, they did exercise them in Part B. But here in Part C, if they were never exercised, that must mean the market price is less than $18 exercise price. So what happens? The warrants lapse. So we debit the contributed capital on the warrants and we credit contributed capital on the lapsed warrants. All right? Don't forget, the reason why we create this contributed capital account on the lapsed warrants is because part of that $105,000 that we received as Easy Corporation included the value of warrants, right? We're not giving them back any of that $63.19, which was part of this $105,000. The investor took a gamble. They thought that the market price would rise above the exercise price, so they took the deal. But that doesn't mean we're giving them back their money. If they chose not to exercise, for whatever reason, the warrants lapse. So this $63.19 now represents contributed capital on lapsed warrants, which means that's money we were paid, part of the $105,000 that the investor's not getting back. Easy Corporation's keeping it. Now, what if instead of Parts B and C, the investor did exercise some of the warrants, 70% of the warrants, and the other 30% lapsed? Well, we're going to do two entries here. The first entry is going to be to record the exercise of 70% of the warrants. Well, don't forget, one warrant gets one share, right? But we had 1,000 warrants, but we're only exercising 70% of those warrants, right? So 70% of the warrants is 1,000 warrants times 70% is 700 warrants. Don't forget, one warrant, one share. So 1,000 shares times 70%, we're getting 700 shares at $18 a share. So we've got to get from new corporation 12,600. Well, that represents 70% of that number, right? Because they're not going to pay us to get 1,000 shares. They're only going to pay us to get 700 shares because they're only exercising 70%, right? So we're going to debit our cash for 12,600, debit the contributed capital on the warrants, not for the whole 63.19, but only for 70% of it, because we're only using up 70% of the warrants. And using the book value method, we're going to credit our common shares for 17,023. Now, the rest of the warrants that lapse are how much? Well, don't forget we had $6,319 in warrants, right? So if 70% were exercised, then the other 30% lapsed. So we're going to remove the contributed capital on the warrants and credit our lapsed warrants, contributed capital, for $18.96. So this concludes our example on warrants. I hope you found it helpful.